This is Amend and Progress, your go-to podcast from Vodori for all things promotional material review. Get ready for actionable insights, valuable perspectives, and best practices to elevate your workflow and team morale.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amend and Progress, Vodori's podcast about the material review process. I'm your host, Annalise, and today we're going to be talking about converting medical and scientific information into promotional claims. Joining me in this conversation today is Dr. Joe DiCapite, Director of Strategy for the UK and Europe at Vodori. Joe, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely, anytime. So since you last joined Amend and Progress, I've added a new sort of section to the episode, some quick fire getting to know you questions. Are you up for it?
I am, yeah. I can't promise I can do it quick fire, but I'll do what I can.
Take as much time as you need. Okay, first question. What is your morning beverage of choice?
Easy one, that's black coffee. Black coffee, but I have quite a specific way of doing it. I've researched, as you'd expect, the best way to do black coffee, at least the best way I think I can now do black coffee, which involves, I use an AeroPress. There's a very specific process that I use for it, specific water temperatures, but that gives me my coffee that makes me feel good every morning.
In true form, a scientific approach to coffee for you. I was expecting you to say tea.
Tea, yeah. That should be what I would say as a Brit. But tea for me now comes kind of 3 or 4 times during the day rather than as my first pick me up.
Okay. Absolutely fair. I mean, breaking down those stereotypes. Okay, second question. What is your current or favorite hobby?
Yeah, I've got a number, but I think the current one that I have to talk about is paddle tennis, which is something that's not really, I don't think it's quite crossed the pond over to the US yet. You have pickleball, which paddle tennis is a little bit like pickleball. It's kind of halfway between squash and tennis, massive in Europe. It's become massive in Italy, and it's just a little bit easier on the body now that I'm approaching, well, I'll be 40 this year. A little lower intensity of the sport is a good thing.
And is there a place that you're going to like pick up games, or, how are you playing the game on a regular basis?
Yeah, so here in Turin, there's an awesome venue for paddle tennis. It's at the old the velodrome. There's the Falso Coppi velodrome in Turin is now being converted into a whole series of paddle tennis courts. So it's a beautiful setting to play in. And a lot of fun.
Amazing. This is a new fact. I didn't know this. So that's super fun. Okay, final question. What is one productivity hack or best practice you use in your daily life?
Put the phone in a different room. So there's actually quite a bit of evidence now coming out that you can put your phone out of sight. You can put your phone kind of in a drawer in the room that you're in. But it's like the attention-grabbing effect of having a phone, social media, and all those things. It's shown to be really quite detrimental. And one way of getting around it is if it's in a different room, genuinely out of sight, out of mind, and kind of not drawing you in. It's so much easier to get into that kind of that flow state where you're getting some good work done, good attention.
Mm-hmm. It is incredible, the draw of the phone. It's subconscious. So that's it. I'll have to try that one. So that might be helpful to me.
It's all about the different rooms. So as far away, you're like the other side of the house if you can.
Yeah, my method has always just been face down on the desk, but that doesn't work. So, here we go. I'll be trying this today, different room. Well, awesome. Just fun to get to know you and let the audience get to know you a bit better. Okay, topic of today is converting medical and scientific information into claims. I thought that you would be a perfect person to talk about this, and I even came to you because you've served on both sides of this process in industry. So could you just talk a little bit about your experience with this, both on the med affairs side, on the brand and commercial side? Just what's been your experience in converting med sci information into claims?
Yeah, well, actually, so my first role was in the industry as a medical writer. So I joined a pharmaceutical industry as a medical writer, and this was a massive part of what I did. I went on a number of courses. The European Medical Writers Association, EMWA, put on a really good series of training courses. I think they're still running. So I started in that role, and a big part of that was converting the scientific literature into impactful, concise claims. So then as I've gone through in the industry, working in med affairs, which has been really taking the scientific, trying to find the data and turning it into something approvable. I've then moved into marketing, which has got a slightly different lens. I'm often given more of those kind of claims that are nearly ready to go, and there's just a bit more molding to do in that when you're doing the marketing side. And I've also been on the review side of it as well, where I might be trying to assess a claim that a different team has put together, and I'm trying to work out its suitability. So yeah, I've done a number of roles all across, like with lots of tendrils into this process. So I've tried to bring some of that experience together to contribute to this discussion, and also hopefully give people some best practices of how to do this process as effectively as possible.
Incredible. Well, let's start picking your brain. In terms of this process of taking information, converting it into claims, why is this hard? Where do teams struggle based on your experience on any of the sides of the spectrum that you want to talk about? But I'm just curious from your perspective why this is a difficult process, or if you think it is a difficult process.
It is a difficult process because there's a lot of gray area. When you're taking a claim, so say you find a claim in a scientific paper or a study, or you've seen it in an abstract at a congress, you can't just take that exact sentence and plonk it into your materials. It's going to be out of context. It might be littered with jargon. It might not align exactly with the indication of the product that you work on. Mm-hmm. So the word that I like that you mentioned there was process. It's difficult because there is a process of turning something that you see in a scientific paper or one of these sources I've mentioned, turning that into an approvable claim that you can use in a campaign is a process. And if it helps, I'll talk you through that process, because people usually don't even realize that they're doing this process in their head. It usually becomes so second nature that when you are going through that dialogue in your own mind, or the dialogue with your counterpart in the brand team, all of these stages need to be hit, but you don't know that it's happening. So I think the thing that will shine a light on why it's difficult is if I talk you through, at least in my eyes, those different stages that you go through, turning a scientific statement into a claim.
Yeah, let's go there. So let's talk process. Maybe It's like, talk me through the process from your perspective, how it should go, or maybe how you've had it go in the past based on your experience.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and simplify it down for this process by talking about adding a single new claim to an existing campaign. So I'll come maybe on the end about how you go to create a brand new campaign. But in this instance, let's talk about just one claim to a new campaign. So a typical situation that might happen is the brand manager may attend one of the scientific congresses. They attend some sessions. They hear someone talk about a piece of information that they think, this would be wonderful to include in our story. This is in the story about our drug. Or it could be the scientific advisor is reading a paper and they follow a few references through, and they end up reading a new paper that they hadn't been aware of, and they think, this will be really great to include in our campaign. The very first thing that needs to go through your head is appropriateness. So, is this new bit of information appropriate for the campaign that we're talking about? And what I mean by appropriateness is, what is the indication of your drug? And the new data that you've just come across, does that data align with the indication that you have in your drug. A very easy example here is if the data is only from children and you work on a drug that does not have a pediatric license, then kind of at that point, forget it, that's not going to work. But other things that come in, what line of therapy is the data that you might have read something about the class of drug that you work on and some exploratory data showing that it could be used earlier in therapy. Now, that might not align with your current marketing authorization and your license. So that's where in the first glance needs to be, well, is this data appropriate to be including in a promotional campaign?
Okay.
So that's step one. Is it appropriate? Step two, I've called, is the juice worth the squeeze? Sometimes you need to ask yourself, well, yes, there is this new data, but how much does it add to the story of the campaign that we're talking about? Now, always remember that any good campaign for any product, and in fact, I firmly believe in any scientific endeavor, you're always telling a story. Like, you always need to give context, then you need to build on that context to start giving the evidence, and then you need to kind of build on the areas of uncertainty before moving to conclusions, for example. If this new piece of data does nothing to strengthen that core story, then it's probably not worth the time it would take the brand team to put the effort into finessing and doing the next 5 steps that I'm going to talk through. So, they're the first things that kind of come to mind. Now, the type of thing
really quick,
yeah.
Can I interrupt you? So in terms of, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is that a dialogue that happens, or is that really up to the judgment of particular individuals to make that call? Like, is that something that's brought to the table and discussed? Is that based on like someone's experience and what they know in terms of effort? Who's involved in making that call?
Yeah, the thing I would say is never be afraid to ask the question. If I was talking to a brand manager, or a brand manager's listening to this now, never be afraid to ask the question of your other members of your brand team, saying, look, I've seen this data, I'm not sure if it's going to be that valuable. So it can be a group decision. The more experienced members of the team will often have a good idea. They'll look at the data and they'll say, do you know what, it's not going to add anything. I would still say bring it to people's attention that you found this interesting data, even if it's not something that's worthy of kind of introducing to the campaign. People are still interested in the therapy area. People are still interested in knowing what is the data that exists around the product, around the disease area. So it's relevant to add in, but you might not need to go through the full steps of saying, well, now let's really focus on getting this into an approvable state so that we can put it into the campaign.
Okay, that makes total sense. Okay.
Yeah, but great question, because you don't want to be self-censoring really useful information. Right. And so it is worth sharing, because even if you think, you know what, I don't think this is worthwhile, someone else might see, like suddenly come together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, super helpful. Okay.
So
I interrupted you. Continue on.
Yeah, no. Do ask the questions. It's good. As a walk, I'm sure when you ask the best practice, dialogue is critical in all of this process. So I would call step 1 and step 2 is very much like the preparing for having a new claim. Okay. The third bit is where the complexity really starts to come in. Does it hold up? So this new bit of data that you've come across, now's where you need to start appraising the quality of that evidence. Now, if it's something, there might have been an update to national guidelines, or there has been an update to a consensus statement from a professional body, you can be quite sure that that's gone through good, rigorous processes. And so usually, does it hold up? If it's in a guideline, the answer is probably, not definitely, but probably. If, though, it's a single epidemiology study that you think gives the perfect context of why everybody should be focusing on this particular symptom in this particular disease state that everybody's previously overlooked. Well, if it's a single epidemiology study that goes against the consensus, then you really need to be saying, does it hold up? What is the quality of the evidence that's come from? Like, how big is the study? Was it randomized? Are there control groups in this study? Was it interventional or is it purely observational? Like, you need to then be doing the assessment of the quality of the evidence to consider whether it's then something that can go into a campaign, because you can be sure that in that dialogue with your team, if you're questioning the quality of the evidence, when that ends up in the real world and a doctor may see it and say, actually, I don't think that evidence is a high enough quality, or a competitor sees it, as kind as your brand team or as hard as your brand team may be, the competitors are going to pull at every single thread. So that question of, is the data of high enough quality to include, is a critical one. So step 3, and that does come from experience, that does come from knowledge of your own country's compliance processes, and it comes from a good solid base of critical appraisal of evidence. And it's one of the things that the medical teams are trained on. Like, I've gone through extensive statistical training so that let me just caveat it. I've been through extensive statistical training. That doesn't mean I have extensive knowledge of statistical processes, but we have a general understanding of, when we read the statistics of something, we can say that holds up, or that study design is known to be weak in this particular area. And so you can make that judgment call.
So that's definitely, I mean, you've indicated that's definitely dialogue between both teams, correct? I mean, that would require medical and scientific expertise to make that call.
Yeah, and I also think there's a responsibility on the scientific member of the brand team at that point to explain their decision, because it's often not immediately apparent, for example, why you might say, do you know what, the quality of this evidence isn't good enough to include. Like, there are some quite complex things that you have to consider. You have, if it's one of your own studies, you have primary endpoints, you have secondary endpoints, you have a hierarchy of secondary endpoints. That means if, like, one of the secondary endpoints misses, well, suddenly, actually, from a statistical standpoint, you can't make strong statistical claims, if any statistical claims, about the other secondary endpoints below that in the hierarchy. You need to make sure you bring people on the journey of why, if you were to use that claim, that's going to open the brand and the company up to risk, because it doesn't necessarily, that claim, you might not be able to say anything very strong at all about that claim. So that's in it. Yeah, the dialogue's important, and there is a teaching element that goes along with any decision.
Okay. What's next in the process? Yep.
The next bit is actually the bit that I hopefully should be a bit more obvious. Step 4 is trying to turn it into plain English. So a lot of science is written in jargon, and once you've made that decision, it's appropriate. You think it adds, the juice is going to be worth the squeeze, and the quality of the evidence is high enough. You're not going to lift that section of text and put it into your campaign wholesale. It's going to need some interpretation. So I'm a big believer that one of the places science falls down is that we're not able to communicate it succinctly and clearly. But there is the challenge that as you try and make that claim precise, accurate, and impactful, you sometimes need to therefore make changes to the claim to make it, or to that string of text, to just make it more understandable. And you also at this point need to be thinking about your different audiences. So, it might be appropriate for one audience to use very kind of clinical trial language. You might talk about, this was a non-inferiority study looking at this outcome with this bound of effect size, and that's perfectly understandable to them, to that audience. But you then may be talking to a different lay audience and you try to translate a non-inferiority study, that language, you may, well, I don't want to use that language. I want to say our drug was comparable to their drug.
Mm-hmm.
Or you might try and say our drug was equivalent to their drug. Now, you start getting into very dangerous territory, especially with that last one that I mentioned. So a non-inferiority study, it has like a relatively well-defined term, characteristics about what it's looking for. And you may think that that's enough to say that your drug is equivalent to a competitor's drug, but that's not the case. Like, equivalency then has a much more loaded meaning, and you need a different type of evidence to claim equivalency. So this step of trying to turn the claim into plain English can be challenging, especially when you're considering, well, I'm trying to make it appropriate for the audience that the material is designed for.
So this is where variations come into play, correct? Because you're converting it into claims that for various audiences. So then you have, I imagine this gets to be, how long does this take? You know, if you have to create several variations, like what is the time required? How long should teams account for to sort of do the English translation of the medical and scientific information?
Yeah, when you're experienced of doing it, when you're a lot more familiar with it, once you've got that approvable version of the wording kind of in its core sense, like in its plain English scientific, it's not too hard to then do some adaptations of it. Usually there's only so much you can ever do to really abbreviate it down, because sometimes you just can't get away with not mentioning the statistical significance. You just can't get away with not talking about the effect size. You know, there are some things that just we always have to mention those, but there might be some subtle changes in wording that make it more or less appropriate for different audiences. But it needn't take too long, but it is the area that things can go wrong if you try to in your striving for plain English. If you overstep and become not as precise and not as accurate as you would like, or as you need to be, you can overstep, and then suddenly you have overemphasized the effect size of your drug by omitting some information that they had in the kind of the primary reference. So it can be challenging getting that plain English bit right, but when there's experience, making those small adaptations needn't be too onerous a task.
Okay, so we've gone through some stages. We're up to translation. What's next? What's next in the process?
Yeah, so I kind of collapsed those two. The step 4, is it plain English? And then step 5, horses for courses. I don't know if that works in American, but that's about getting the right language for the right audience. So exactly as you mentioned, the variations. Now, the next bit is, unless you've been in this, you wouldn't instinctively have seen this as a challenge, but laying out, you've now got your approved text, but your next step is to lay that out in an artworked document. And suddenly, actually, it's not that common that you literally write a phrase from left to right across the top of the page in its entirety. There are accompanying graphs, accompanying images, and other information on the page. So I'll give you 2 examples where challenges come in. There is a well-known UK code case where there was a claim it was a non-inferiority claim, that they used the term equivalence, and that was accompanied by an image of a set of scales. And that image of a set of scales tipped the balance, if you excuse the pun, and gave too much of an emphasis of direct equivalence of the 2 drugs. And it was found in breach, in part because the added emphasis that the image gave it. So that's one way in which layout can impact. And then you also need to consider like juxtaposition claims on a page. You might have a page that talks about epidemiology of a certain aspect of the disease state, and then an efficacy claim of something of your drug. By putting those two claims on the same page next to each other, you're making a link between them, even if no words link them together. And so you're then making a judgment decision as a reviewer and as a marketer. Have I now impacted the message by including these two messages on one page directly next to each other? These are the gray areas that suddenly, yes, you've approved the wording. Yes, you've spent months refining things and getting it, but then suddenly you see it on a page and you think, oh, well, I never realized that we were going to be using this on a page with that other bit of evidence. Now
Sure.
I feel less comfortable about what we're doing, and suddenly the impression of that page changes. And so that's then hard to capture.
That sounds complicated. How do you teach someone about the gray areas? Because certainly there's some judgment that's involved, and that's harder. But for someone that maybe is newer, is not as tenured in these roles, what does the education look like from team member to team member on this is the gray area, this is how we've navigated in the past? How do you teach others about the gray areas and what to do?
I'm a big believer in mentoring. That I think every marketer should have a mentor that is available to that more junior member of the team to discuss these decisions with. So, on a regular basis, you should be sitting down with each other and explaining that decision-making process. So whenever a new member of the team joins, especially if they're new to industry, so they may be very, very scientifically literate. They may be medics. They may have been treating patients. And so they've got amazing value to bring into the team, but they won't have had experience of making these judgment calls on marketing campaigns. And so that dialogue, again, that word would keep coming up in those mentoring sessions, is really valuable, because although you may go into it thinking there's going to be a one-way passage of information from the more experienced person to the less experienced person, there's so much dialogue back and forth where you both learn from it. So that's the one thing I would say, mentoring. And also on a weekly basis, I think every brand team should come together, and it can be a 30-minute meeting, can be quick, succinct, and there's an opportunity to discuss these, not just between the two members that have been working directly on the project, but the wider team get to see how those decisions have been made.
Okay, I think that's super helpful. We were at, anything else to add there?
So I was just going to add the very final thing. So
let's go there.
I called how to lay out that page and the overall, how it changes the impact of that claim on that page. The final thing where the grayness comes in is then stepping back on the whole piece. And now you look at the whole overall impression of the sales aid or the whatever material, and what's the overall impression that I now have from this? Because you may have just added one efficacy claim that by itself doesn't change the impression, but a couple of times, you do that 2 or 3 times during a campaign, suddenly your balance between efficacy and safety and the overall balance in that piece suddenly goes, this may be now erring much too much on efficacy and we've not got enough safety. So that's that final bit, step back and look at the overall impression of what impact that claim has had on the piece. So yeah,
boy, oh boy,
yeah, it's like an exploration in a jungle of grayness. It really, and opinions change. If you've got changes of review teams halfway through a campaign development, halfway through a claim development, they will have different views on what is approvable and what isn't. And it's a challenge. I
imagine someone might say, well, this has been approved in this way before, But if it's someone new on the review team, that changes the whole dynamic. And so, differing opinions are completely valid. But I imagine that's maybe some tension that comes up, is that you rely on past experiences, but, someone that's new to the team doesn't necessarily have that background or context driving those decisions. So, again,
That's
I feel like
the
dialogue thing just comes into play once again.
Yeah, dialogue, and because it does happen, like it's great when you've got a stable brand team who have worked together for a long period, and you know that it's going to be the same marketeer and the same medic making those decisions. But when you have different members coming in, they might have risk tolerances that are different to other people. One thing that, because it's inevitable people have different views of the grade, one best practice I would say is on these claims, if you can capture the dialogue and capture the rationale of why that reviewer believes it's acceptable, and the dialogue back and forth with a marketeer, it's really valuable because suddenly you understand why a decision was made in a certain way. This is one of the areas where I do think technology now helps. I never had access to a specific claims module where you could manage a claim and all of the discussion around that claim. You can treat that as its own job in the review system and capture this back and forth and this rationale that has gone into meaning that claim is approvable, meaning that you can capture things to be wary about with specific data points. You might say, if we use this claim, we cannot use it with an image that implies X, Y, Z. So capturing that dialogue does help you overcome the issue of changing review teams during campaign development.
Yep. And back to your episode you did with me on audits, I imagine that information is also super helpful to just, you had talked previously about just having record of decisions. And so this is an area where this is put to practice in terms of capturing the decisions on the gray area to drive just documentation and having that ready for any audit purposes. So nice little tie back to the audit episode that you and I did together.
Yeah. And there's one more thing that I would pull on what I said during the audit episode, which was, try not to be adversarial in this. You're ultimately working towards the same goal, and even more so when you're in a brand team. If you've got a marketeer and a medic, if you're aiming towards an area of trust, because as I said at the beginning, if it's not your medic counterpart challenging you, then it will be your competitor's medic challenging you, or even worse, probably, if this gets in front of the regulator and they're then looking at it, they're going to have a strict view on this as well. And the same goes though for the medic reviewing the marketeer's material. If you're too restrictive, if you're too risk averse, well, you better know that your competitors may have a more pushy view to their risk tolerance, and they may then be making claims that you had previously said we can't claim, and then they suddenly are the dominant drug in the market just because they found a way to say something stronger than you were able to, and that has its own knock-on impact.
Yeah, so many factors to consider.
Yeah.
If someone, regardless, maybe someone has been doing this for a long time, or maybe this is a new team that's come together that's embarking on this process of converting this information into claims, what would be one thing you would want to leave teams with? One comment, note, insight, best practice.
I'm now going to talk about when you're developing a new campaign as a whole, but it holds throughout for a brand team.
Okay.
Sit together and talk together. Brand teams where the medics and the marketeers are on the same station work so much more effectively than when I've been in a situation, marketing sit upstairs, medical sit downstairs, and you rarely have dialogue other than in those situations where something has boiled over and the angry person then has to go upstairs or downstairs. Doesn't foster that sense of togetherness. So sit together and talk together would be my one thing.
I love it. That's a perfect way to end the conversation today. Joe, thank you so much for joining. It's been an amazing conversation. Just really appreciate your insights on this topic.
No, not at all. Always enjoy talking about things that I've done for so many years in the industry.
Absolutely. Well, hope to have you on again soon. I'll always knock on your door to come on and talk about something new.
Great. Thanks, Annalise.
And folks, the conversation doesn't stop here. Please follow Vodori on LinkedIn. We're posting updates on new episodes. Join in on the conversation. Tell us things you like about the episodes, questions you have, content you'd like to see in future episodes. We would love to hear from you. You can subscribe to Amend and Progress on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review the show. Until next time, this is Annalise signing off from Amend and Progress. Have a fantastic day.